Back. Heard you missed us. We're back. How you doing, Watson?
I'm okay. I'm okay. How are you?
Oh, I'm great. Never
I'm
been better.
sorry.
Never been better. Yeah, no, I'm having a really rough week. Hopefully it doesn't get any rougher. My Wi-Fi is still screwy. So last week we had to cancel the live stream because my Wi-Fi was on the fritz. They came and fixed it, and it's still on the fritz. So they're coming again tomorrow. My solo live stream tomorrow will be not on because my Wi-Fi will be in the process of getting fixed for the second time. So yeah, that's going on.
Sounds like you got some Mercury retrograde issues going on.
Big time.
Yeah.
Big time. Being an
terrible.
astrologer does not protect you from this. Just because you're aware it's happening doesn't mean it's not going to happen. Yeah. And as I was just telling Patrick before we started, I've also got a cracked tooth and I'm in a fair bit of dental pain today.
Oh God. Yeah. All right. Well, we'll we can make this a shorter one, or one that's easier on you.
Let's give the people what we were trying to give them 2 weeks ago.
So 2 weeks ago we were going through Mercury retrograde through the houses and focusing especially on Mercury retrogrades in Virgo. So we only have about a week left of this current Mercury retrograde in Virgo.
That's
but
right.
We got like halfway through the houses. We were only able to get up to roughly house 6, or almost onto 7. And we started running out of steam. So we figured we would just pick back up where we kind of left off. We had briefly touched when we were kind of looking for a 7th house example, because we hadn't actually prepared all of the examples before going live. We briefly touched on the chronology of Gwyneth Paltrow as a potential sort of 7th house example of Mercury going retrograde in the 7th house. So I actually did a little more digging on that, and what came out was actually quite interesting. It turns out it was way more intricate than I first thought. So I'm going to share my screen now and share with you a little bit of
Please
what
do.
I found with the timing of Gwyneth Paltrow's relationships and Mercury retrogrades that occur in Virgo in her 7th house. Now, if you're a Pisces rising watching this, some of these same things could potentially apply to you. Obviously, there may be some particularities of her chart that might explain some of the more particular timing of things that have happened. But in any case, I will sort of take you through a little bit of what I found with Gwyneth Paltrow's chart. So here's something really interesting that happened. There's a few other things that happened before this, but I thought this is just such a classic Mercury retrograde in Virgo in the 7th house type of incident. So if you didn't know, Gwyneth Paltrow was married to Chris Martin for several years. Before they met, the way they actually came to meet is that Chris Martin made a joke. He's the lead singer of the band Coldplay. He made a joke at a concert on August 7th, 2002 in Philadelphia. He made a joke on stage about Gwyneth Paltrow being his girlfriend. And this was because his girlfriend at the time was supposed to come to that show, but she hadn't. She'd sort of stood him up. And so he said, well, I'm dedicating this to my girlfriend, Gwyneth Paltrow. And so then there was this kind of rumor mill about them potentially being like together, even though they weren't. And so Gwyneth Paltrow is really confused. And this is right before Mercury is about to station retrograde in Libra and go back into Virgo. And so you can see actually on the day that he makes this joke about Paltrow being his girlfriend, Mercury had just ingressed into Virgo. Is pretty close to her descendant. So literally her future husband, is like announcing his connection to her at this time. And this is so interesting too, because this is an example of how sometimes transits that happen in your own chart don't always relate to things that are happening in your life. Gwyneth Paltrow was not aware that this was happening at the time that it did, but it's just one of those weird quirks of life, that that the guy she ends up being with kind of almost manifests or predicts his importance in her life, by announcing it through a joke at a concert that they're going to be together. And so within a few months, they do end up being together by about October 2002. And this is interesting because if you were looking at this without thinking about Mercury, you would assume, oh, October 2002, that's just a red 4, right? Or red 2.
Red 2. Yeah.
Right.
Meaning for those who don't know, that this is a period when Venus would be going retrograde in Scorpio, which it did later in October.
Right.
Yeah.
So another kind of interesting thing that was happening at the same time that kind of ties this all together is you can see that this was happening in the midst of a Saturn return in Gwyneth Paltrow's 4th house. You can also see that there were recently eclipses in her 4th house. We would know that there would be difficult circumstances involving parents in this time. And this is actually when her father died. Her father died in October of 2002.
Yeah.
And so she met Chris Martin in person, like right around the time that her father died, which was right around when Mercury was stationing direct in her 7th house. So we can see that later in that year of 2002, that Mercury went retrograde in the 8th house of death and then stationed direct in her 7th house. So she literally was dealing with the deathly connotations of the 8th house and dealing with the tragic developments involving her father. But then it kind of weirdly ends with this arrival of a new relationship in her life. And actually, this is where the famous Coldplay song "Fix You" comes from. It's his attempt to sort of give Gwyneth Paltrow like encouragement or
console
comfort.
her.
Yeah. So that's kind of what that song comes from. So
also very interesting, if I may. In between him, making this announcement during the concert and the death of her father and the relationship beginning, she had a birthday, and she went from 29 years old to 30 years old. In other words, she went from a 6th house perfection year into a 7th house perfection.
There you go. You got it.
Yeah.
So it go. I mean, I don't want to spend the whole time talking about Gwyneth Paltrow's love life, but
come on. What else is there to talk about? What could be more important?
But but I noticed there were other Mercury retrogrades in Virgo that seemed to be kind of important, sort of signaling these turning points, this changing of the guard almost of like who functions as a partner in her life. So even if you go all the way back to 1997, she had just, well, first of all, she ends up with Brad Pitt over the course of a Mars retrograde in Virgo, which is kind of a different thing relating to her Mars in Virgo in
the Mars retrograde in Libra in 1997 started at 5 Libra, very close to her sun, and then went back to, I think, like 25 Virgo or 20 Virgo, something, or maybe even earlier in Virgo.
Right.
Yeah, but it started in Libra on her sun.
Yeah, so they ended up splitting up in June of 1997. And so we go to June 1997, you can see Mars is back in Virgo at that time. So it kind of began under Mars retrograde in Virgo and then ended, interestingly, with Mars in Virgo. We can also see that she would have recently had eclipses in that time. But what's interesting is while we don't have the exact date of this next event, we know that Mercury and Venus would have gone through her 7th house in the months afterward. And we know that somewhere in this time, somewhere between June 1997 and October 1997, Gwyneth Paltrow ended up at a dinner party hosted by Miramax, where she met Ben Affleck, who was there because the Good Will Hunting film was still about to come out. And so there was a Mercury retrograde in Virgo in the 7th house in the months between the end of her last relationship and the beginning of her new relationship with Ben Affleck. So while I don't know the exact dates pertaining to that dinner meeting or when they started dating, I think it's relevant enough to know that these Mercury retrogrades only happen in the same part of the zodiac every 6 to 7 years. And it just so happens that one of those happened in the precise months where she left one relationship and entered another. So that all happened between June and October of 1997, the switch from Brad Pitt to Ben Affleck.
Yeah.
So, and then while she was married to Chris Martin, something kind of interesting happens. She is involved in a couple of episodes of the show Glee, and she ends up doing this filming, doing these songs for this TV show Glee, and that happened in September of 2010, and that's where she met her now husband, Brad Falchuk. Now, I'm not saying anything like untoward happened in September 2010, but that was when she was still married to Chris Martin, but met the man that she would later marry after her marriage to Chris Martin ended.
And that's
So,
also a red too in September of 2010.
yeah, there you go.
So it's
These
a
things,
Venus return of when she's getting together with Chris Martin.
yeah, no, exactly. And in fact, so 1994, late 1994 was also another red too. And actually the red 2018 Venus retrograde, that was when she married this guy, Brad
Oh,
Falchuk.
good grief.
So there's kind of a
she's really
Venus,
locked into the red too.
yeah, she's kind of locked into the red 2 cycle, but we can also see how Mercury also has this kind of assisting role in that Venus cycle as well. This is September 2010 just happened to be the month that Mercury went retrograde in the 7th house.
Wow.
So, there's a few interesting tidbits there.
Very interesting.
Us,
very interesting tidbits. I did actually just put her chart up again for a moment. There was one thing I saw. I looked briefly at my Gwyneth Paltrow file while you were talking, and I have a chart. I'm just sort of nitpicking here, but it's interesting. I have a chart for the announcement that a relationship with Brad Pitt was made, and it's June 16th, 1997. Did you have that specific date, or did you just have June of 97?
That June.
I have this is the day it was announced.
Date.
This is the day it's announced, and you can see it is the Mars return. Like, perfect.
Yeah, perfectly. Okay, so I didn't have the exact date that the breakup was announced, but
I must have taken it from like MTV News, like literally back when they, when this was happening. This must be an old. Let's see, what's my source for that? One is CNN.com, people.com, exactly, like things that were happening at the time.
Wow.
Yeah.
So so it's interesting to see how she's locked into a few different cycles. It seems like Brad Pitt was her big Mars relationship, and with Mars in the 7th house, she has this Venus red 2 thing going on that seems to be acting as a sort of general timer for relationships. But then we also have this Mercury retrograde, which seems to have this function of either changing the guard or raising complications potentially in her relationships. She was married and then ends up meeting a guy she marries later during a Mercury retrograde in Virgo. Mercury retrograde in Virgo occurs in the time frame where she's switching from one relationship to another. A Mercury retrograde happens when the guy she ends up marrying makes a joke at a concert, about them being together, and then that ends up bringing them together. There's just a very mercurial kind of quality in some ways to the experience of relationships.
Yeah, before you stop sharing, no.
Sorry.
I have one other thing I wanted to say. I know we're spending a lot of time on Gwyneth. No, it's all right.
All right, there we go. Go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, I have to turn it back on. The one thing I just want to point out as an aside. I mean, obviously what happened to the? Oh, there we are. Obviously, we're talking about the Mercury retrogrades in Virgo, which you've nailed down beautifully, and that's the central theme. But since the red 2 keeps coming up, I just wanted to point out that, she doesn't have any, not only does she not have any planets in Scorpio, she only has one planet in a fixed sign, and it is Venus. But it just goes to show that sometimes you can have a chart where, like, the same Venus interval keeps popping up in a really noticeable way, as it does with her, clearly. Even though that interval doesn't, is not positioned in a place in the zodiac that has any real relationship to any planets in her chart. But what we do know is every time there is a red 2 year, she will just have entered into an Earth sign perfection year. So in 2002, her birthday, she went into the 7th house. And then in 2010, she would have been in a Taurus perfection year, which does make Venus the Lord of the year and is opposite Scorpio. And then the other one in 2018 would be Capricorn, where she has Jupiter, which is her, her chart ruler in the North Node. So there is something that's another way that we can use the Venus intervals and look at a chart. And, while a lot of the times it really does pop up in these obvious places, like say crossing over the natal ascendant or the natal moon or something like that, sometimes you do that. This is something I've seen enough that you have someone like Gwyneth, where clearly that Venus red 2 interval is always coming up every 8 years in really noticeable way. But you can't really see it in the chart. You wouldn't look at this chart and know offhand. That's the thing.
Red twos would be a big deal, right?
Yeah. That's the thing. Sometimes, sometimes someone's got like, 10-degree Scorpio rising, saying, every 8 years that red 2 Venus retrograde's been going over their ascendant. And sure enough, you do some investigating and it does turn out to be as central and poignant to the person's life as you would expect. But yeah, Gwyneth does have the kind of chart where you might, if you're not sort of careful, you might overlook that because it's not really presenting itself, and you have to dig into the timeline to find it.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Sometimes there are sudden observations like that that are only really noticeable through actually studying their timeline. So
yeah,
definitely something for people to remember.
Yeah.
Let's take a look at some of the comments here. Her Goop Empire makes more sense. Listen to astrology, celebrities. Yeah, but see, that's always the tension with using celebrity example charts. Gwyneth, I have enjoyed a few Gwyneth Paltrow movies. I don't think she's a bad actress. But I'm not like a super fan or something.
No. We talk about we talk about all kinds of people, and no, I'm not a Gwyneth Paltrow fan, but I'm not a hater either. Sometimes she's in a movie I like, that's fine.
I liked Shakespeare in Love. Yeah, it was sort of a guilty pleasure. I liked it. I thought she was nice as Pepper Potts in the Marvel movies.
Yeah.
But
she was very good in those. Yeah. No, it is, anyway, we don't need to. We're not actually here to if they're good at
gossiping.
Yeah, this is not gossiping. We're using the resources that celebrity gossip gives us and using it for our astrological
right.
edification or our education.
On celebrity gossip to have like a timeline,
exactly.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, their lives are very well documented, and so that makes them useful to us. But yeah, we're not here to sort of hate on someone or to like stand for anyone. I often talk about people's charts who I literally can't stand, like Nixon or whoever. So anyway.
Sure. Did you have a 7th house example you wanted to go over? Do you want to move to the 8th?
Let's move to the 8th. To the 8th. I think your 7th house example was much better than the one I have. Do you have an 8th house one, or shall I?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I do have an 8th house one.
Well, I'll show mine, and then we'll go to your 8th house.
You show me yours, I'll show you mine.
That's what you always tell me, Watson, and then I get left standing there exposed to the elements while you back away. No, I'm just kidding.
All right. Anyway, all right, share your screen.
Okay. Shut up and share your screen already.
Do the astrology.
Or I'll give you a second toothache you won't forget. All right. Oh. Okay. So this is actually kind of a gruesome one, but it is the 8th house. This is William S. Burroughs. For those of you who don't know, he's a writer, poet, and sort of media figure. Very influential. He was, in one sense, part of the what they called the beatniks. He was friends with the likes of Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac. In fact, he and Kerouac co-authored a book when they were quite young that I consider to be better than anything either of them ever went on to do. And yeah, he's just sort of a, he's quite the innovator when it comes to using literature and media. He's acted in a few movies. You might have seen him in Gus Van Zant's Drugstore Cowboy, for instance, with Matt Dillon. Anyway, he's this notable figure. You can see he's got one hell of an Aquarius stellium here. He's Aquarius rising. Excuse me, with Jupiter, Uranus, Venus, Sun, and Mercury all in Aquarius. And then a Moon Saturn conjunction in Gemini down at the bottom.
Just like Gwyneth.
Yeah. William S. Burroughs is exactly like Gwyneth. Now, okay, so this story is a bit messed up. Now, William S. Burroughs is he literally wrote books in the 50s. One was called Queer and one was called Junkie. And he quite unashamedly identified with both terms. He was a heroin addict for most of his life. Or most of his adult life anyway. And a very famous, he's like your junkie's junkie. He's even more famous as a junkie than, say, Keith Richards in some ways. Keith Richards kicked it, but William S. Burroughs, I think, went to his grave with it. Anyway, William S. Burroughs was gay, but he did get married to this woman, Joan Vollmer, who he had a very close intellectual bond with, and they were both drug addicts together. And through a long sort of stream of events that I won't get into, they wound up living in Mexico City in the late 40s, early 50s. And one night they were having a little gathering. I think they were entertaining some guests over, drinks and probably drugs. William S. Burroughs and Joan Vollmer, apparently Joan Vollmer being his partner, his wife, there was the game that they would sometimes play to entertain their guests, which was the William Tell routine. Joan would put a wine glass on top of her head, and William would shoot that wine glass with his gun, just like William Tell shooting the apple off the
very head. Safely, of course. Yeah.
Very safely. Yeah. Very safe, very sane. Absolutely. The kind of thing, just good, wholesome 1950s American entertainment. All kidding aside, though, William, apparently they'd done this before, and Bill was a gun nut on top of everything else. He was also a gun nut, again, quite unashamedly, and but he was good with a weapon, but he wasn't good on this night, and he shot Joan Vollmer in the head and killed her. It was obviously an accident, but quite an irresponsible one, and one that I think most sensible justice systems would hold him accountable for. But through some maneuvering, he managed to get around the charges. And was never convicted for it. And it just kind of added to his legend, for the rest of his life. He was, there's that guy who shot his wife in a William Tell, maneuver. So it's
Mercury retrograde in the 8th, deadly mistakes.
Yeah. Along with the Venus retrograde and everything else going on there. Yeah. Right, deadly mistake. Venus retrograde in the 8th. Yeah.
Wow. That's really interesting. I have a Mercury retrograde in the 8th, which kind of gets at a different notion of the 8th house in terms of hidden things and secret things, which is very interesting, of course, because Mercury is really the planet of giving voice to things and talking about things. So we'll see how that makes some amount of sense here.
I'm just going to answer one question before you go on.
Oh, yeah.
Elsa X is asking about the moon. She says the Moon-Saturn conjunction has come up in a few conversations recently. Would really appreciate any insight into that. What I would say about that conjunction with regard to William Burroughs, he was the heir to a fortune because I think his grandfather developed the adding machine or some kind of technology, 19th century technology. I believe it's an adding machine. But he was the absolute rebel of his family. He's from this sort of well-to-do Missouri family, and he went off and became this sort of beatnik junkie, outwardly queer gun nut, wife killing poet laureate of punk and of everything. I mean, everyone sort of looks up to him despite all this. But that Moon Saturn conjunction in Gemini, very interestingly, Uranus was conjunct his natal Moon Saturn conjunction in 1944 when he met Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac, who would go on to be his lifelong sort of compatriots and part of this little authors circle, the beatniks, the beat generation, all that stuff. So that's the other thing about that Moon Saturn conjunction. The reason he met them, he was older than him. He was a good decade older. He was 12 years older than Kerouac, 12 years older than Ginsberg and 10 years older than Kerouac. But he met them at Columbia University because he was older. He was already in his 30s, but he was going to school with these guys in their 20s. And that's how we met them. So that's the one thing I'll say about his Moon Saturn conjunction. I think it says something about his total disconnect from his family, and also just it points to the period with the Uranus transit when it comes to that Moon Saturn conjunction, that he finds this new family, people who will be important to him for the rest of his life.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good answer. A second Mercury retrograde in the 8th house example is released to Ronan Farrow.
Right.
So Ronan Farrow, he's the guy who, if you didn't know, he's the child, supposedly, of Woody Allen and Mia Farrow. There's some doubts potentially as to his paternity, but
let's just put it out there. He looks way more like Frank Sinatra than Woody Allen. Mia Farrow had previously been married to Frank Sinatra, and she has suggested that there was an affair between them while she was with Woody, and so therefore Ronan could very well be right. I mean, I think he is.
But the more important thing is in relating to Mercury retrograde in Virgo is that he is the reporter that brought to light the sexual abuse allegations of Harvey Weinstein, the movie producer. And so he had been doing this report. He'd been doing this investigative reporting on Weinstein for about a year. Ronan Farrow was employed by NBC at the time. And we don't know exactly when he began doing this, but it was around 2016, supposed to be around a year, which would potentially mean that he began potentially investigating Weinstein during the Mercury retrograde in Virgo of 2016. Now, what's interesting is when he gets to the Mercury retrograde in Virgo of 2017, the next year, his report starts getting closer to the time of publishing, and there's more news kind of going through back channels that he's doing this really explosive report on this very powerful person. And NBC tells Ronan Farrow that they're shutting down his story and they're not going to publish it, basically. And that happens on August 18th, 2017. Just a few days later, or maybe immediately, it's not exactly clear, Ronan Farrow leaves NBC. He switches sides, and he decides to publish his reporting with the New Yorker. So the New Yorker ends up being the one to blow the lid off the Weinstein investigation later that year, and that kicks off the whole #MeToo movement, and everything really kind of comes back to this initial report that Ronan Farrow made. So I think it's really crucial that at the Mercury retrograde in his 8th house, there's this very tense discussion kind of going on about this private information, this explosive information, this hidden information, and being told to keep something quiet. We can also see this is happening at the same time as his Saturn return, close to his midheaven, and so this is obviously a really huge kind of make or break moment for Ronan Farrow. And it's also so interesting knowing that because Mercury naturally has an association with kind of being neutral or ambiguous or switching sides, and that it does this so often as it changes from a evening star to morning star and vice versa, that it was in this time that he actually decides to kind of defect from NBC and find a kind of new way to get the word out about this secret information that he has. So I thought that was another really interesting manifestation of the themes of the 8th house with Mercury retrograde.
Yeah, that Mercury retrograde would have gone from his eighth to his seventh over the course of that those few weeks, starting from when that the trouble with NBC started, and he was in a seventh house perfection year. He's in a Leo perfection year, so that Mercury retrograde going from the eighth into the seventh would also
So
play into the perfections. Yeah.
so it's what's interesting about that too is we know that like both for the Gwyneth Paltrow and for the Ronan Farrow examples, they're both at their Saturn returns. Approximately like they're in the rough Saturn return period as these Mercury retrogrades are happening. And I think what's important about that is that obviously there are some Mercury retrogrades which kind of stand out more in your own life. And so it makes sense that it's almost like a smaller cog of the wheel, So if you happen to be on kind of a, at the turn of a larger cog like Saturn, then the sort of smaller, transits on top of that, gonna be things which sort of, be straws that break the camel's back. They're going to be um, uh, amplifying or otherwise providing just that little bit of extra momentum towards whatever the sort of underlying momentum was. Because there is a way you could read this entire story more as Saturn transiting over his midheaven and moving through his 11th and coming to his natal Saturn placement. But it's interesting that when you look at the more particular dates that something like the Mercury retrograde in the eighth house kind of stands out. So that was my example for Mercury retrograde in the eighth, pertaining to the
Fantastic.
disclosure of private or sensitive or delicate information.
Fantastic. All right. And you're going to give us a ninth. I have a lot of 10th house ones, but
Okay.
I've got a lot of 10th, 11th, and 12th actually, but I don't have ninth, and you've got
Okay.
ninth.
Yeah, I've got some ninth.
The only thing,
So
I was just going to say, sorry.
yeah, yeah,
Sorry, I
no,
keep
feel
doing
free,
this to you. I'm
feel
sorry.
free. You're fine.
I blame the toothache. I'm going to absolve
Yeah,
myself
no,
of all
no,
responsibility. I'm not
absolutely.
rude. I'm just suffering.
Yeah, no, God,
Poor
yeah, I can't
me.
imagine.
Everyone feels sorry for me. No,
I
I
do.
just wanted to say, I don't have a ninth house example, but I did notice, Emmanuel Macron is Capricorn rising. So
Hmm.
just now he's been having Mercury go retrograde through his ninth house, like just in the last, since it's been retrograde.
That's right.
And yeah, he just got, France is doing the Rugby World Cup, and he got booed at the Rugby World Cup. France actually wound up winning the game, and the French are happy about that, obviously.
Yeah,
But
Saturn and Virgo, right?
yeah,
So
yeah, no,
kind of a
yeah, he's
disapproval
um,
message.
right, and he's doing his whole like sort of the G20 was just happening, and anyway, if you're interested in a very contemporary example of Mercury retrograde in the ninth, have a look at him. But sorry, now continue. I will shut the f up and
Oh,
and
no,
let
no,
you
you're
let you.
fine. I mean, it's, yeah, I had trouble sort of finding a very, like, straightforward, example. I found a bunch of examples of people with Mercury in the ninth in Virgo that made a lot of sense. One of them I thought that was kind of interesting just off the top of my head was, Monica Bellucci, the,
Mm,
French-Italian actress. She has Capricorn rising with Mercury and Virgo in the ninth house, and what I thought was so interesting about that is that, she this isn't necessarily so remarkable for an actress, but she does speak quite a number of languages, and she's actually kind of made a habit of like traveling to the country and living
mm,
there to learn the language before she ends up shooting the movie where she's speaking in a different language.
okay,
And she also does all of the foreign dubs of her films so that people can hear her performance in different languages. So
nice,
I thought so I thought that was just a very straightforward Mercury and Virgo in the ninth house, like someone who um is versatile with language
sure.
and doing so in kind of an international context, So I thought that was interesting. But in terms of like a Mercury retrograde in the ninth house example, because that Monica Bellucci is more or less just a natal example of Mercury in the ninth. Um, so I have it's sort of a personal one, but my in-law, uh, I guess my father-in-law, he has a kind of interesting chart, and he well, actually, interestingly, he currently has Mercury retrograde conjoining his natal Mercury right
Right,
now.
and his son-in-law
Right
is
as we,
discussing his chart with a bunch
yeah,
of
right, with a bunch of nerds. Yeah,
nerds.
so what's kind of interesting is back in 2010, during that Mercury retrograde in Virgo in his ninth house, he was asked to travel to Mexico to train his replacements for his job. And we can see that Mercury rules the sixth house of work and employment. And because he's sort of involved in kind of like a civil engineering type of a profession. And so that's what he had to do is he had to travel to a foreign country to train new employees or to train people to replace what he did. So I thought that was kind of an interesting Mercury retrograde example in the ninth house. Very kind of straightforward. I don't want to necessarily go into more details since it's a private person rather than a public person, but that was I think that's just kind of a straightforward manifestation of like not only the natal placement but even the house rulership, and the fact that it rules the sixth house and that it's like moving, traveling or training or doing sort of mercurial activity for the purposes of work.
Right.
And that would be the case for Monica Bellucci as well. Actually, she has Mercury ruling her sixth house as well, and it's primarily as part of her preparation for movie roles. That she underwent this kind of more immersive approach to learning languages. So that's about as much as I have for the ninth house with Virgo examples. I kind of tried to keep it to Mercury retrograde in Virgo because I'd like us to be able to tackle Mercury going retrograde in all the signs,
Yeah.
it gives us future content possibilities.
I was initially sticking to Virgo, but I was finding other examples in other signs that I thought I would, that
Sure.
were worth bringing out. So
Well, fire away with your 10th house.
Yeah, I've got some really interesting 10th house ones.
All right, awesome. I have one for each of the remaining houses. So.
Oh, okay. No, I have multiple for the remaining houses. So this should be good. All right. Just a moment here. And away we go. Okay. Presidents. John F. Kennedy was nominated the Democratic presidential candidate when Mercury was retrograde right on his natal Saturn and his midheaven. So yeah, this is okay. This
kind of mentioned this last time.
What?
The Mercury retrogrades in the water signs.
Oh yes, yeah.
And the election and the inauguration and we discussed this in a preview in the first part of the video. I don't know if you want to.
Did I brought this up last time?
Yeah, you went through.
Why did I bring it up?
Because Mercury is retrograde.
Oh, I'd forgotten. It was 2 weeks ago.
No,
okay.
Yeah, right. But you went through the whole thing already.
What, of Jimmy Carter as well?
Yes, and how?
Yeah. And then George W. Bush mission.
Oh yeah, you went through all of that.
Oh,
stuff,
okay.
Yeah.
So I didn't realize
it's okay though.
I didn't realize we'd done the 10th house. Oh, okay.
No, we didn't do the 10th house. It was because you were making, for anyone who's watching this, you were making the excellent observation that in a given year, Mercury retrograde will always go retrograde roughly in the houses that are trying to each other.
Okay, so I did
and thus for like a presidential candidate, because of the way that the nominations are spaced from the elections and the inauguration, you can sometimes have a Mercury retrograde each 3 of those events. And for presidential candidates who were nominated or won the elections during Mercury retrogrades, there's something about their tenure that ends up being sort of unstable, inconstant, or not being able to have sort of an enduring, lasting sort of influence or something. And that you related that to Kennedy because, obviously his term was cut short.
Right.
And for Carter, it was,
wow, so
kind of guy. So That's
All
kind of
right.
the summary, at least.
All right. Well, thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
That's a brilliant summary. I was obviously clearly really brilliant to come up with it in the first place.
No, you're
Forget it
extremely
entirely.
brilliant. You're
And then forget
extremely
it entirely.
brilliant to come up with that.
Well,
I
I think I,
definitely
I
thought that
think
was
you're even
cool.
more brilliant for remembering
Oh,
that I did it and me being a total moron.
oh,
Well, here,
oh
let
no,
me. I've got
no
some other.
worries.
I've got some other 10th house ones.
Okay, yeah, no, that'd be great. I'd love to see this.
Again, I'm doing all the gruesome and grim ones, I guess, this week. Maybe that just is par for the course.
And I guess I'm doing all the celebrity ones this week.
Right. So, Jimi Hendrix, the last 3 weeks of his life were Mercury retrograde in his 10th. And it really was kind of par for the course. So this is him. This is the 31st of August, 1970. This is 18 days before he died. Mercury's just going retrograde in his 10th conjunct Pluto. This is the famous Isle of Wight festival. Everyone performed here. You can get videos of Leonard Cohen, Miles Davis, Joni Mitchell. Certainly Jimi Hendrix's concert here is available pretty widely. The Doors performed here and their video is out. Really sort of big, huge music fest. And it's one of his last shows, but a bunch of things kind of go wrong. If you watch the video, some of it's really good and some of it you can see he's not at his absolute best. One of the things that happens, he's playing a Flying V guitar. It's not a guitar that he usually played. He was usually sort of a Stratocaster guy, but for some reason at Isle of Wight, he's playing a Flying V. And it kind of reminds me of, if for those of you who've seen the movie Spinal Tap, the parody
Yeah.
movie in the 80s, there's a scene in Spinal Tap where Nigel Tufnell, they're playing an Air Force base and he gets radio signals through his pickups. Like he's picking up the military, air traffic controller. And when Jimmy was playing Isle of Wight, he also got something similar to that. His his guitar was picking up some kind of weird radio signals, and that was sort of interference. The other thing was his bass player Billy Cox was dosed with LSD just before he went on stage, and so he had this miserable time trying to cope with playing music while his mind was coming undone, and he wound up leaving the group, which sort of, so Jimmy's last few weeks he's really in turmoil. His bass player winds up quitting. He plays a show, his very last show is a week after the Isle of Wight, so you can see Mercury's gone from it hasn't gone very far and it's retrograde. This show is in Germany. This is his very last concert, and it breaks down into a riot, and the rest of his tour is canceled. And he's kind of, he winds up back in London because he doesn't know what to do with his, with himself. His bass player's quitting, and he's, trying to figure out what to do. He's just built a recording studio in New York City, and yet he flew off to Europe to play concerts to try and make some money. So yeah, his life kind of left on this weird note. And then this is the chart for his death. When he died on the 18th, Mercury's still retrograde there in his 10th. Not that I think that signifies his death, but just, the kind of the circumstances he felt himself in. He was not sure what to do. Everything had gone sort of wrong. And he was trying to figure things out when the end came. So there's that.
Wow. Wow.
Elsa X has a funny comment. I'll touch on that in a minute. So yeah, that's a pretty good one. Oh yeah, there's another one that has to do with death. Just a moment. I'll pull this up here. Bear with me, everyone. There it is. This is another notorious death that occurred when Mercury was retrograde in the 10th. And you get kind of the same impression in a way with this one that you do with Jimi Hendrix in a certain sense. There we are. Okay, so it's not Jimi Hendrix, it's Princess Di. But when she died in the car crash in Paris, Mercury was retrograde in her 10th, about to make the interior conjunction. You can see there on her Pluto Mars. And yeah, I mean, this was sort of, these were Mercury retrograde sort of circumstances, right? They wound up sort of in a car with a driver who was drunk and not, not really like it all kind of happened happenstance. The fact that she was in that car with that driver on that night, and then they're trying to escape from the press and they crash. Um, I think in this case, the Mercury retrograde really, really does kind of play into the situation in some way, if you catch my drift. You can see natally, she was born with Mercury retrograde in the 8th. So there is some sort of something natural about the cycle.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah. So yeah, I think a bit more with Di. I mean, my recollection, I don't know everything she was going through at that time. I mean, obviously she had broken up from Charles, and she's got this new boyfriend, and things got a little sort of crazy. But yeah, there is an element of Mercury retrograde, I think, in that death.
That's interesting too, that they were like getting away from the press because of news about the relationship, because it was in September of 2016 that Harry, her son, was getting together with Meghan Markle, and it was like a bit after that Mercury retrograde, I think, but it was like in October, November, like they were basically, that was when they started making these first statements, kind of pushing back against press intervention in their lives. I think Harry is a Capricorn rising, which would have put it
he is
in his 9th house. So we got another 9th house example potentially. I mean, this is just kind of off my head, so I'm not confident with the dates there, but sometimes you can start making these kind of cross connections, no ephemeris in sight,
Sure. Sure. Yeah.
So I have a 10th house one I can share, which I think works pretty well, especially in terms of house rulerships as well. So here we go. Entire screen. All right. So my 10th house example is for the chart of Jennifer Lawrence. So we have a timed chart for Jennifer Lawrence, the movie star, another celebrity example, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
And we can see in her chart that for any Sagittarius rising, Mercury doesn't just rule the midheaven, but it also rules the 7th house of relationships. And sometimes when the ruler of the 7th is in the 10th, like it is in Jennifer Lawrence's chart, one interpretation you could derive from that is someone whose relationships end up being with people who are in positions of authority or bosses. And so something quite interesting is that for about a year, Jennifer Lawrence was in a relationship with the film director, Darren Aronofsky. They met when he cast her in the movie Mother with an exclamation mark. I haven't actually seen this movie, but I know that it finished filming on August 30th, 2016, and they started dating in September 2016. That was the first public sort of public report of them being involved together romantically, and the shoot for the film ended on August 30th, 2016. So it seems that whatever sort of, I don't know, tension might have been building up during the shoot, it seems that they were able to finally, once the shooting had finished, that they were able to be in relationship together. And we can see August 30th, 2016 was right on the day that Mercury stationed retrograde in Jennifer Lawrence's 10th house. Now, what's interesting, so we can see through September 2016, as that relationship was beginning, and as she has just completed the work on this film, we see this Mercury retrograde happening in the 10th house and making this conjunction to a natal Mercury. So what's interesting is they date for about a year, and then the movie comes out in September of 2017, the next year, during the Mercury retrograde in Virgo that happens again.
Right.
Now, what's interesting is the movie, when it came out, was very poorly received. It was considered to be kind of a flop because it has a lot of very violent imagery in it. So it stands out as one of the few like Jennifer Lawrence flops. Not because it was necessarily a bad movie, but it was just a very difficult or challenging movie, I guess, for critics and audiences. I guess, yeah, there's just a lot of sort of shocking imagery in it, and so it didn't really have a good appeal. And I guess because the movie didn't do as well as they'd hoped. I guess this put a lot of stress and pressure on the relationship. I read an article where she basically said that that was basically all he wanted to talk about in the aftermath of this movie. They had to keep going to these interviews about him promoting this film, and it wasn't doing well. And so eventually they split up in November 2017, and they kind of cited the pressure of the negative reviews of this movie.
But that also would have been right in the middle of the whole Me Too thing, which had her in the middle of everything.
Yeah. So there's, so we can see how the Mercury retrograde in Virgo seems to be the kind of central player here in accounting for not only the timing of the beginning of the relationship, but also the central event that ends up causing the decline of the relationship. And it's centered around something that was professional. It's centered around something that was reputational. It involved all of those themes of the 10th house, something which was career oriented, her reputation, and the idea of bosses or authorities. And he was the director of this film, right?
Yeah.
And the writer. So Mercury. That's pretty much the idea. You can see how all of those different house themes are kind of tied together and kind of come alive, when Mercury actually went retrograde through that sign. So that is my 10th house example.
Okay. Well, I haven't seen that movie either. I tend to like his work, his movie Pi is one of my all-time favorite movies, and Requiem for a Dream was pretty good, but
he is
no one hits home runs every time.
Well, to be fair, I kind of get the impression it is definitely a Darren Aronofsky film. It just, wasn't to everyone's taste. I mean, in the same way that I doubt people would probably agree that Requiem for a Dream is,
this is true, and Pi is not easy either. Pi is,
right. I think
not for everyone. It's true.
Darren Aronofsky, I think he might be Mars and Scorpio rising.
Yeah, I tried to find his birth time. I did get the birth time for Sean Gillette, who starred in Pi, but I don't think I was ever able to. Aronofsky was born in Brooklyn.
We have a time for him as C rating.
Okay, C rating. Okay,
and it's actually Aries rising with Mars and Scorpio.
Yeah, he has Mars and Scorpio. Yeah.
Yeah, so if that time is correct, even though it's got a C rating, then we know that Mars is kind of the ruler of his ascendant, and I think it's conjunct Neptune and Scorpio as well. So he's someone who has he's privy to like very disturbing visions, probably, that he works through in film. But I've liked a lot of his films.
Yeah, his sun is opposite her sun. His sun is at 23 Aquarius, and her sun's at 22 Leo.
Nia asks, what about the ruler of the 10th and the 7th, the other way around? Well, I think you could probably make a pretty similar interpretation. When the ruler of the 7th is in the 10th, or the ruler of the 10th is in the 7th, then you know that it's going to connect those two topics together in some way. It doesn't always have to be romantic. It could be that maybe you work in a professional partnership with someone, and that's a big part of your public reputation. It doesn't have to be romantic. Usually it is, but I mean, there's a similar relationship like that in the chart of the filmmaker Zack Snyder, and he has a production company with his wife. They work together on projects. So that's a little bit about the ruler of the 7th and the 10th. So that's my 10th house example.
Fantastic.
Mercury retrograde in Virgo.
Well done. So you're doing all the glamorous movie stars, and I'm doing all the like, this person died, this person killed someone, this person. Yeah.
Well, I got one dark one, a little bit dark.
Okay.
I mean, some of them have been dark.
I'm not trying to compete. I'm kind of, I'm like, what the hell? Did I just only come up with dark ones? No, apparently not. I've got some non-dark ones coming up. All right. Are we moving on to the 11th?
Yeah, sure.
All right. Okay. And this would be, I've got some more president ones here.
Okay.
This is Jimmy Carter. Mercury is just going retrograde in his 11th house with Jupiter. How many days? It doesn't show being retrograde, but it's like, oh, no. That got in there by accident. It's 10 days after.
10 days.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. No, it's the day before it went retrograde.
Yeah.
It is stationing retrograde in his 11th with Jupiter. in his 11th, and he's the president, and he went on TV and he gave this speech. It's called the Crisis of Confidence speech. Now, this speech is great. This speech is like absolutely the speech that everyone on planet Earth should have been hearing in 1979. But it's just not very presidential. It was kind of a downer. He was kind of in the speech, he's kind of it has the vibe that he's like scolding the American people, you know. And look, great as the American people are, sometimes, like any other person, they deserve some scolding. But yeah, it didn't come off well, and it's seen as sort of like, the gas crisis was the summer of '79 was one of those summers of like really long lineups for the gas pump and all this stuff. And so instead of like, going on TV and giving everyone a like, hey everyone, it's going to be great, don't worry, we'll get through this kind of speech. Instead, he was like, how do you think we wound up here? We waste everything, and we're not serious about our resources and all this stuff. Anyway, I'm paraphrasing his speech really poorly, but you get the point. It was not it was ill-advised as speeches go. So yeah,
so conjunct Jupiter. He wasn't wrong,
no,
but
he was
he wasn't wrong, but maybe needed a different rhetorical strategy.
It's the kind of speech where like 50 years from now, it could very well be that like the record is that it was the greatest speech in US history and the only one that ever mattered and the only one that any president ever should have given. But that'll be because the planet's on fire and he's the only one who, was
right
saying anything about it. But yeah, no, it tends to be, held up as this, sort of political disaster, which you can, not very Libran of him. He wasn't really thinking about the big picture in that one.
Right. So that's really interesting. Did you have another 11?
I think I'll just do, because they're all presidential, so I may as well I'll just do these three presidents and then
okay.
I'll hand over to you.
Sure.
This is a famous one. This is Mercury was retrograde in Bill Clinton's 11th house when he had to finally admit that he did in fact have sexual relations with that woman. So yeah, I mean, this kind of speaks for itself. Natally, he has a lot of stuff in the 11th house. This was just before his 52nd birthday, so he's 51. So he's in a Capricorn perfection year. And he does have Saturn in the 11th house. But yeah, this Mercury retrograde, I mean, this is pretty straightforward. He was telling everyone he did not have sexual relations with that woman. And then Mercury goes retrograde and he's like, well, actually, okay. Yes, I did.
Yeah.
Very, very self-explanatory.
So having to go back on something that you've
exactly
said
exactly. And like the crisis of confidence speech, this is, like the 11th house really is like speaking to the American people. The 11th house is your tribe, your clan, your gang, your peeps. And so for a president, there is something, you're speaking to the 11th, you're speaking to the people, certainly the people in your party,
Sure. Yeah, because I imagine this, probably wasn't just like this statement, but also the chaos that this probably caused for maybe Democrats, people in his party, his allies, in a sense, who had to kind of stand up for him and maybe had to take their own words back and probably had to do some explaining, with his own party, with his own friends and allies and stuff. So I think that there's that makes sense, certainly as an 11th house type of example. We might imagine that Carter might have had similar conversations with Democrats who were like, why did you do that? Why did you, so you can see that, the 11th house connotation of those examples. I think it's really good.
Yeah. And then finally, the last one, George W. Bush, he had Mercury retrograde, also with Jupiter, interestingly, kind of like Carter with the crisis of confidence. This is when he first met Vladimir Putin and said he, looked into his soul. I looked into his soul.
Like snake in the grass. Yeah.
So yeah, this is a relationship that will. So this is the. It's been a long time since I heard that. Yeah.
Sorry, totally derailed it with my little W. Bush. Sorry, it's been a while since I whipped out my W. Bush impression.
Yeah, well, it's been a while since
Yeah,
anyone did.
yeah,
Whoops. What am I doing here?
it can stay in 2008 where it belongs.
Right. So this is the opposite end of, say, like Bill Clinton, admitting he lied about Monica Lewinsky. This is a relationship that's starting, and Bush makes this very sort of flattering kind of remark about Putin, and by the time Bush's presidency is over in 2008, he really knows that he's lost Putin. That things did not go well. He, if he looked into his soul, well, the soul is saying something different now. So yeah, it's the opposite end. It's the beginning of something that will have a different sort of response in due time.
Well, it's an interesting thing in hindsight, knowing that the Republicans eventually did kind of become. I mean, I don't know if there's ever a definitive moment you could say that like conservatives went from like being kind of opposed to Russia and the Red Scare, etc., to kind of becoming like weirdly admiring of his like authoritarianism. But it's an interesting moment to it's given that Mercury retrograde happened in his 11th house, that there was almost like a switch in attitude, perhaps. I know we've linked this before to like the Venus retrograde in Leo, which coincided more definitively with like the rise, like that was sort of coincident with like the rise of Trump's popularity during the 2015 primary and the lead up to the 2016 election, and Putin's own kind of triumphant moments in 2015. But yeah, that's an interesting sort of foreshadowing or something. Also worth noting that Mercury retrograde in Gemini was opposite that Mars retrograde in Sag.
Right.
So there's kind of this alarm bells, should ring off probably, when Mars is configured with, Mercury.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, big time.
yeah.
I mean, this is still the sort of somewhat friendly Putin, right? I mean, this is 2001
Right.
Putin. It's not the guy he is
The
today.
unknown quantity Putin.
More
Right.
so. Yeah.
Yeah. So I have an 11th house example as well, and interestingly, this kind of connects back to at two of my previous examples.
Oh.
So
that time that Jennifer Lawrence and Gwyneth Paltrow had an affair?
No, so Kevin Smith. So in Kevin Smith's chart, what's kind of interesting is this is a really good example of how whole sign houses kind of works, because while Mercury is on the MC itself is in the 11th house. So we know that this Mercury, as well as Mercury retrogrades that happen in Virgo, or any transit in Virgo, should, in theory, have more to do with this notion of friendships, but also this connection to professional reputation. And so what's so interesting is that in the lead up to the publication of the Harvey Weinstein abuse reporting done by Ronan Farrow, basically Weinstein knows that he's circling the drain. He knows that his life is about to change forever when this report is released by Ronan Farrow. And so he ends up calling up his old friends and all his old sort of Hollywood pals to see who's still sort of supporting him. And this is happening in September of 2017. Now, Kevin Smith has, a huge debt really to pay to Harvey Weinstein. Harvey Weinstein made Kevin Smith. Harvey Weinstein was like,
Kevin Smith, Quentin Tarantino. There's a long list of people.
Yeah. Kevin Smith. I mean, Kevin Smith before, back obviously before the scandal broke and everything, he described Weinstein in the highest terms of praise, right? He said, he's my father practically, and how much he supported my work. And so in September of 2018, they'd already been kind of on the outs when Saturn went through Virgo in 2008, because the movie Zack and Miri Make a Porno didn't work out so well. But in September of 2017, he gets this old call from his old friend Apparently, in the month leading up to the report being published, he gets this old call from his old sort of friend, basically sussing out his level of support, and that's the last time that Kevin Smith heard from him. And so it's so interesting because obviously after all the allegations sort of came out, he publicly disavowed his friend.
Yeah.
Harvey Weinstein. And, he's even said before, there's a quote from Kevin Smith from a podcast. He said, "My entire career is tied up with the man. No fucking movie is worth all this." And so it's so interesting because you can see how the topics of the 11th and the 10th are kind of tied together. His reputation centered on and surrounded a powerful figure working on his behalf, which we can see in this chart that's represented both of those things by Mercury. So it's so interesting that the Mercury retrograde in 2017 that preceded the explosive information that Ronan Farrow was reporting on, would end up signaling this huge change in Kevin Smith's allegiances and his alliances, going from being one of Harvey Weinstein's biggest defenders to being one of his, biggest detractors. Kevin Smith, he's done everything he can.
I've seen to walk it back. To walk it back. Yeah.
He gives like $2,000 a month now to the Women in Film charity or group or something. He's really tried to make amends for his prior association. So I think that's a pretty good Mercury retrograde in the 11th house experience. Where are you? There you are.
It would be interesting. We don't have Weinstein's birth time, do we?
No, we don't. No.
Yeah, that it's your Weinsteins, your Epsteins. I mean, that's the thing is, you don't have to like them. There's a lot of astrology to learn in there if we could just get their charts. So,
right. Yeah. No, it's so interesting. After I was sort of looking at this, I realized like, wow, it would be so weird to see. Like you can kind of see this sort of happening in different ways in people's charts. For Ronan Farrow, this was this Mercury retrograde in the 8th story, but for the people associated with Weinstein, this was a Mercury retrograde in the 11th, story, like, and having to change your mind about your friends and who you're allied with, so I mean, he had even made a production company named like the Harvey Boys or something like after Harvey. I mean, like talk about like mixing up like the 11th and the midheaven, but like to like an almost hilarious level of disaster, like. So it's really, that's my Mercury retrograde in Virgo in the 11th example.
And speaking of Gwyneth Paltrow, there's that whole story, right? Because like apparently Harvey was harassing her, and then Brad Pitt had words with Harvey because Brad was her boyfriend at the time.
Exactly, and this might also explain maybe some part of the Mars story,
retrograde of 97, right?
Exactly, and 95. So. All of these things kind of start overlapping.
It's a small town.
Yeah, I noticed that there were some interesting themes that kind of went through these different examples.
Sure.
So, do you want to move to 12th house?
Yeah, 11th house. You're all done with your 11th house?
Yep. Yeah, that was my 11th house example.
Okay. So, all right, do you want to do 12th house first?
Yeah, I can do a 12th house example.
Yeah.
So this one kind of connects to Jennifer Lawrence in an interesting way, but I'll show you how it works. So, whoops. Okay. You can see my messy.
I'm trying to share the screen. Oh, there we are. Whoops, I had it. There we are. Okay.
Do you see me?
Yeah, I see it.
Okay. So this is the chart of Kate Upton. She is like a model. Very widely admired model. And so what happened to her is in 2014, she and Jennifer Lawrence and others were the victims of this phone hacking scandal where they got nude pictures from these phones. Actually, this is harkening back to a previous example from the previous video we made. with our first house example, that someone being a victim of a hacking scandal.
Right.
So what's interesting about this is on the day that the hacker of her phone pleads guilty, we can see that this was on September 20th, 2016. So Mercury had like just stationed direct a few days before, and this happened in her 12th house. And so essentially her enemy, this
Hmm.
hacker, was announcing himself and admitting, that this is what he had done. Now, as for the transit of the actual hack itself, I don't know if this was necessarily a 12th house event, but I thought it was interesting in light of some of the other examples we've looked at where um, uh, famous young women have like creepy dudes coming after them and have like 12th house transits. It's because
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
a pretty obvious manifestation of the 12th house topic of enemies or adversaries. So I also thought it was quite interesting too, because in her chart, Kate has Jupiter in the 12th house, which would seem to maybe suggest like things working out well relative to these figures. So this guy, he ends up ultimately like pleading guilty and just facing justice. So I thought that was kind of an interesting example potentially of a 12th house Mercury retrograde, that the legal process of arraigning and getting this guy to face the music, who had done this, who to Kate Upton, was clearly like an enemy.
Yeah.
It's an interesting manifestation of that type of transit. It's also interesting to note that for Jennifer Lawrence, this he was also responsible for the hack into her information, but obviously that happened. That Mercury retrograde had a very different meaning for Jennifer Lawrence, because we looked at this exact same retrograde, and this is when she was basically in the aftermath of having completed the shoot for Mother, and as she was beginning this
Right.
relationship with Darren Aronofsky. So you can see it's it's complicated. Not all transits. It's interesting what astrology tells us is important, about what's going on in someone's life. Because you could have used that transit to make this sort of, you could have made an interpretation of that transit for Kate Upton that would have made sense within the context of this hacking scandal. But for Jennifer Lawrence, that's not how that sort of appeared.
Right.
And I guess Kate Upton was like the main person who was sort of affected by that. But
Was this the case that also involved Scarlett Johansson? I remember that happened to her too.
maybe it was the 2014 hacking event.
Okay, I wasn't keeping a scorecard at the time, so I wouldn't know if that was the. But I remember the exact same thing did happen to Scarlett Johansson. Although I
Right.
imagine it's not like they're the only ones that this has happened to. This is something
Yeah,
there's a lot of them.
that came out. So it happened August 31st, 2014. That was when a collection of like hundreds of private pictures of various celebrities came out, and so people
Okay,
who were affected by that included Jennifer Lawrence, Kate Upton, and
but not Scarlett Johansson. That was another time.
Scarlett. Maybe maybe that was a different one. I mean, it's terrible that there's so many, right?
I know.
Which
It's like,
one? Like, yeah.
yeah.
Kirsten Dunst was affected
Okay.
by this one.
All right.
So yeah, I mean, there's probably a whole other sort of astrological story, with that development. But
For sure.
uh,
All right.
yeah. So
Good
that's my
one.
12th house example. Yeah, your enemy, gives up and declares themselves, announces
Okay.
themselves guilty of their crime.
Well, there's something else that can happen with Mercury retrograde with regard to enemies. You can make enemies that you didn't have. Like for instance, maybe like a mistress that you sleep with while you're
Oh,
while you're
almost got through without.
you knew it was coming. This is the new Rick roll, right? Instead of playing the Rick Astley song, we just pull up the Donald Trump chart whenever we want to disturb each other. But hey, these are,
No.
I find these transits interesting.
Oh, for sure.
This is Trump the day that he had his affair with Stormy Daniels, and not unlike the Monica Lewinsky thing, because this is such a public affair. We know when it happened because there's testimony. We have a chart. We know it happened on the evening of the 13th of July, 2006, in Lake Tahoe. Trump's almost having a Mars return and all that stuff. But yeah, here's Mercury retrograde in his 12th house, the sign that he actually has natal Mercury in. And he's carrying on an affair that, is supposed to be secret, so secret that he'd be willing to pay money to make sure no one ever found out. Although that won't necessarily work out for him as he hopes.
Yeah, wow. It's also so interesting seeing that Venus conjunction on his sun opposite Pluto. It's like someone who is dealing with this idea of like forbidden fruit or forbidden desires or something like that.
Right.
Just unable to resist kind of this allure of the thing that you want,
So irresistible.
Right. Well, and the sun was even coming onto his Venus at the same time as well. So it's like a double, Venus event. But
right.
Less thought about Trump having a Venus experience, the better.
Well, this is about as romantic as the guy's life.
Yeah, right.
You know what I mean? Like, this really
right.
is.
It's interesting. What something that is kind of interesting though about that is I forget exactly where this is. Maybe this is like Firmicus Maternus or something. But there's some statement in some ancient astrology book that talks about how Mercury in the 12th house could make someone vulnerable to blackmail, because it's the idea of Mercury is like damaging information that works against you. Like if the 12th house is that which is adversarial to you or inimical to you or an enemy to you, then Mercury is the form of like documents and gossip or rumors being a source of antagonism in your life. And so it's so interesting that with having natal Mercury in the 12th and then having a Mercury retrograde occur on the 12th, that the receipts from this event, the words spoken at this time, the missteps taken in this time, end up kind of having this much greater importance sort of later on. This ends up being in some ways part of the story of his epic downfall.
Well, except he's not having a downfall. He's more popular than ever.
Yeah, I mean, I would think, getting arraigned and having to take a mugshot is not exactly your proudest moment.
You would think, yeah. But it's like it's gonna sell. It's gonna be on coffee mugs and all that stuff.
It's the best mugshot.
I give the best mugshots. All right. So I have another couple of ones. These are also sort of related to presidential things. Here I have I've got a pair here.
Okay.
First of all, this is Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis Jacqueline Kennedy marrying Aristotle Onassis while Mercury is in her 12th house. She decides to do this after Bobby Kennedy is murdered because she realizes like the Kennedys can't protect her, and she feels very vulnerable. And so she goes and marries, someone who's rich enough to actually protect her in the way that, that you would think the US government would be able to protect a former first lady, one who's already been, ridiculously close to one presidential assassination. And then her, former brother-in-law goes and gets killed, and she knows like, okay, like I gotta do something. So that's basically the arrangement here. She's getting married for the second time, but there's kind of a she's going against the Kennedy family in a way. I think that's where the 12th house of it all plays. She's
betrayal.
Yeah, there's a sort of like, how could you go marry some, foreign guy? Like you're supposed to be, holding a candle for John F. Kennedy for the rest of your life. Which she may very well have done had she, not felt like, someone could come gunning for her.
Right.
But with two Kennedys killed in less than 5 years, then,
right. Well, the ruler of a 7th is in the 8th. So, yeah.
Right. Yeah. And then secondly, speaking of Mercury retrograde in the 12th. Her son, John F. Kennedy Jr., and here I go going back to death again. I mean, I've looked at Lady Di and Jimi Hendrix and William Burroughs killing his wife. But John F. Kennedy Jr. was piloting a plane. He was supposed to land in Martha's Vineyard, and the plane crashed, I think, into the sea, killing him and his wife and his wife's sister, I believe. Funny enough, John F. Kennedy Jr.'s wife, Carolyn Bessette, is a red 4, and so is his sister, Carolyn Kennedy, is a red 4. So his sister and his wife are both named Carolyn, and they're both red 4s. So make of that what you will. John F. Kennedy was piloting the plane. So there's Mercury retrograde in the 12th, and it's just like, yeah, not seeing the fog, or just not seeing the thing that, you know, in this case, I guess the fog is the enemy, the sea is the enemy. I don't know. But you know, kind of a classic Mercury
mistakes, technical mistakes, you know, that can have you know, it's weird though, you know, sometimes Mercury retrograde mistakes are just like, oh no, I have to do that thing again, and other times it's like,
oh, it can be huge
life-changing mistakes.
I mean, you can fathom this wasn't just any old Mercury retrograde. It's with the North Node, so it's kind of amplified, but it's also in this big kind of grand. The 1999 was the summer of the grand fixed cross. Right. And this is that point when Mercury is playing into the square to Mars, the opposition.
So it's a pretty heavy.
Yeah. There's all kinds of stuff here that point towards, you know, the tragedy that befell the poor guy who, you know, if he hadn't crashed this damn plane, I mean, he would have become president, right? I mean, this is someone who could have beat Trump easily if he had run in an election. So it's kind of.
Someone said, oh, Chelsea says, can you guys do an election day 2024 episode like the old days with Chris? Would be, and then a series of emojis indicating happiness and curiosity.
Would be cool, exciting, and intellectual.
Yeah. Well, I think we should do like, you know, we could just, I mean, I don't know if it would be like too much, but I mean, I think we could do like kind of like what the Daily Show does, where they have like, you know, election coverage, you know, the whole way through. You know, we could have like a weekly sort of check-in with politics from a sort of historical point of view, astrologically.
Yeah.
You know, maybe that could be part of the show, like a section of the like this week in politics, astrology segment of the show, perhaps.
Yeah. You know, I'm game. I'm keeping track of the election. I'm studying all the candidates and you know, keeping my eye on Trump. I guess my only reservation is, you know, I'm kind of like, you know, I I think Trump's going to win, and you know, anyway, it's not going to be.
So that could just be that could just be the that would just be the drum beat every week. I mean, it would still be interesting to just at least, you know, see what happens. Maybe make some predictions for the week ahead and see how they turn out.
I think
Chelsea likes that idea.
Yeah. No, I'm keen to.
Yes. Like when Harry met Sally. Yes. Well, I'll have what she's having.
Yeah, I'll have what. I just ate a Katz's delicatessen a year ago. New York City on Houston. Sarah Victoria is just pointing out Hendrix's death may not have been self-induced. Some credible evidence that seemed made to seem so. He just told his bad hombre manager he was leaving. Managers may have made more money on a dead Jimmy. That's absolutely true. And I think I've even said as much on this podcast. Or live stream or whatever we're calling this thing. Jimi Hendrix's manager was a badass gangster. Not Chas Chandler, the guy who actually signed him to the contract, but Chandler's partner, Mike something. I forget the dude's name, but he was definitely Jimmy's contract with him was about to run out. The guy was definitely like trouble, like easily the kind of guy who would, you know, kill someone to make some money. He died in a plane crash in March of 73. What's his name? Mike Jeffries. That's his name. Or Mike Jeffrey. Mike Jeffrey or Mike Jeffries. He died in a plane crash in 1973. So it's one of those things we don't, you know, that'll just sort of, you know, never resolve itself. But one of the things is when they found Jimmy, you know, Jimmy apparently died from drowning. with red wine. It was really hard to, lots of people can drink themselves to death, but you can't really drown yourself with alcohol, if you know what I mean. Like his lungs were literally filled with red wine. So the theory is that, some goons, burst into the apartment he was in, and one guy held his mouth open, and the other guy just poured wine down Jimmy's throat until he drowned. Yeah, I know. I'm sorry to upset you. There's really,
I've heard the story. It's just, it's
there's very few human beings I love more than Jimi Hendrix.
Yeah,
so I don't really like to
Yeah,
tell
no,
the story, and it always makes me, it always upsets me to think about it, let alone talk about it. But that is,
we could have had like 30, 40, 50 more years of Jimi Hendrix.
He had so much to offer. He had so much to offer. It kills me. He was just his last year of life. I mean, despite what I was showing you with that Mercury retrograde in those last weeks, that last year of life, he recorded so much music that, just keeps coming out, and it's all great. It just keeps, he had so much to offer, and it's really, heartbreaking. Liz says, I think 2024, rather than being the year that Trump gets elected, is going to be with Nick learn something more about Uranus. Liz, I hope you're right. I think the astrology community is ready for me to ready to have some schadenfreude to see me be wrong about Trump and humbled and kind of humiliated as an astrologer. And I just want to say, I hope so. I hope I have to beg all of your forgiveness for getting you all worked up for nothing when we get to November next year.
I mean, I don't think you're wrong in the sense that, it's not like nothing will happen. I mean, I still maintain that, I think Trump's ultimate destiny is to become kind of like the new Jefferson Davis. He'll become the new leader of this insurrectionist faction of the United States. And now how far that goes, how, whether we end up being a disunited states, with Trumplandia over here and
Sanelandia over there,
that's sort of, I guess, TBD, but I don't think you're entirely wrong. He might not end up being president of the United States. He might end up being president of,
this is true. And I have admitted as much that, if I'm wrong about him becoming president, that, Jefferson Davis was a Gemini who had Uranus on his sun when he was president of the Confederacy, and it could play out that way as well. My bottom line is just, Trump's chart just screams USA to me.
It's star-spangled.
It's a star-spangled chart. And I don't mean this in praise or anything like that. I'm not trying to push anyone's buttons one way or the other, whether they, love the Star Spangles or hate them or whatever. But just, that's what I think. And I hope I'm wrong. Unless he dies, or is distinctly not running in the election, there are some moves to use one of those, use a constitutional amendment to stop him from running because he tried to start an insurrection, and that's supposed to disqualify him. So maybe that happens, and at which case I'll have to, bow to the, bow to everyone and admit my folly.
I don't think, like I said, I mean, I don't think you're wrong. I just don't know that you're wrong in the way you think you'll be wrong.
I get it.
I think you may be right in a way you don't think that you're right. I mean, part of the problem with prediction is that you have to have an imagination. I think 2016 sort of showed me the limits of my own imagination. I don't think many people could even imagine that something like Trump could happen, and it only did happen due to kind of the fluke of this particular system that exists. With popular vote versus
electoral college,
he should have lost. So, but because America's America, because of this particular way that it happened. So I think that prediction is really hard, because not only do you have to kind of trust what you see astrologically, but then you also have to be kind of open to the possibility that of things that you don't understand the context for. I remember back on MySpace, everyone was really kind of freaking out at that point about the Uranus-Pluto square that was going to happen between Uranus in Aries versus Pluto in Capricorn. And I remember people saying, like, I don't even understand how the astrological significations of that could come about. How could we really have sort of like global protest movements sort of happening in this? And it didn't seem like it at the time. It just didn't seem as very possible. But then we actually lived through it, and it's like, oh, that was Arab Spring. Oh, that was Occupy Wall Street. Oh,
Yeah.
that was all of the different things that happened at the time. That was, WikiLeaks and all of these, really where the institutions were kind of rattled, by this Uranian force. And so it's sometimes you just have to trust what astrology kind of indicates, even if you don't have the exact context for being able to say specifically how something will fall out, and if you kind of understand the dynamics at play in a given future alignment.
Sure. Yeah.
Oh, Kelsey has a good question. She has a good question. Do you guys think ZR helps or complicates this? Well, that is a really complicated question, but to keep it,
I guess it complicates it.
Yeah, to keep it semi uncomplicated, I think that it can simplify things if if your model that you're using for ZR is accounting and can account for everything that's happened up to that point. Because the crucial mistake that I made in 2016 with relying on ZR for Trump's chart is that I assumed that just by applying the method kind of in the default way that it would give me the answer that I needed. But I was not able to account for why he was even there in the first place. And that probably should have been a big red flag to me, that I couldn't account for things the way that they had occurred in the past. And that's what made my prediction in 2020 completely different, because when I employed a sort of alternative approach to Trump's ZR, I was actually able to account for everything that had happened before. I was able to describe his whole life up to that point. I was able to find the antecedents leading up to the present moment, and so I was able to much more confidently use and correctly apply, I think, the ZR technique. If you're just using ZR and you're just kind of applying the method without being able to account for what's happened before, then you're kind of going in blind. It's only going to be helpful if it actually gives you an accurate model of how things have happened up to that point. And, if you can do that, then you can have more confidence in whatever prediction you're going to try to make with it. And that's for anything, I think. And now with clients, obviously I don't always have time to go through everything, but I will kind of do a spot check to make sure that the chronology of their life, somewhat approximates and somewhat matches the overall shape of those periods. So, I've written before on my website, I have an article called The Fall and Future of Trump, in which I kind of briefly summarize my main points about what I think Trump will be doing. My prediction about Trump not running in the 2020 election was obviously not correct, but it will be interesting to see if somehow, if they do preclude him from running, if he's actually stopped from running due to an invocation of the 14th Amendment, then he might literally not be able to run. The biggest thing that I was able to project going forward about Trump, based on my work with his ZR, is that the period in which he ran for president as an independent for the 2012 election is what we're heading towards. We're heading towards a larger version of that development at the end of 2012 when he tried to run again. Because in the 2012 election, remember, he started the whole birther thing, and was effectively running for president in early 2011, but then he was kind of humiliated by the Osama bin Laden assassination and the release of Obama's birth certificate. And he was kind
and Obama roasting him.
and him getting the roasting of his life at that White House Correspondents' Dinner in 2011, which is still just amazing. But and Seth Meyers as well. Seth Meyers did a great takedown of him as well. But so he dropped out of the race, and that event actually is what corresponds to his 2020 loss. But if you follow the same logic, then we know that later on in 2011, he decided to run again. In fact, he switched his parties. He switched parties at a loosing of the bond, and that loosing of the bond corresponds to events that occur before the next election, which is why I said, I don't know that he runs in 2024, but he definitely looks like he's running in 2028. It should have a similar outcome as 2020, but this is like such a bastardized version of this argument. So I just have to encourage you, just find that article called Trump's Fall and Future on my website, and I explain it in more detail and with greater clarity than what I'm bumbling with now. So it makes it is kind of complicated, but it can be simplifying if you can account for everything that's come up to this point. So that's what I'd have to say on that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Have I looked at Kamala Harris's? Yes, I have. Yes, I have. I looked at Kamala Harris's a little bit on the Basement Astrologers podcast with Kip. But I haven't published anything yet on Kamala Harris's chart on her ZR specifically, but I did comment on it in that podcast with Kip on the Basement Astrologers podcast.
Yeah. Bliss to be is asking, what does Trump's progressed lunation phase look like? And I'll just show you quickly. His progressed moon has just been with Jupiter. It's just separating from Jupiter now. They're in his third house. And so if we go ahead month by month to election time, what date is the election? I'm forgetting now. Is it?
I believe it's November 6th. Let's see.
Yeah, 5th. Okay.
2024 election.
Is that right? November 5th.
Yeah, that's correct.
All right. By which point his progressed moon is here in Scorpio, down at the 4th. And, you know, election season is the sun in Scorpio and all that. But yeah, as someone was pointing out, Jupiter will be conjunct his sun, Venus on his moon. Yeah, there's quite a bit going on there.
Right. Now, that Venus-Jupiter opposition is also going to be straddling Kamala Harris's ascendant-descendant axis. So it's going to be an interesting showdown, potentially, between these two if they end up being kind of the main nominees. I presume that she would be the VP candidate, but who knows? I've also written about Joe Biden's ZR as well.
Yeah, I have my doubts there.
But someone's asking, what is my alternative way with ZR? Again, really complicated, but I've written about this on my website again. But basically, the complication that I came up with, rather, the solution that I came up with to address the inconsistencies of Trump's Zodiac Releasing from the Lot of Spirit was to reverse the position of the lots, so that his lot of spirit is where his lot of fortune is, and his lot of spirit is, and vice versa. So you basically just flip the position of the lots, and that was able to, I felt, give a much better description of his overall life. But this would take, like, this is too complicated to get into. You'd have to just read what I've written, or I can make a separate, full
that'd be a whole
explanation,
episode,
but it would be a whole thing. It's too huge.
All right. Yeah, my I'm as I said, I've got a raging toothache, and I'm on more Tylenol than I should probably be on. So I'm not feeling great, and if you don't mind, I'm ready to wrap this up.
No,
I'm sorry to be so pathetic, folks.
No,
it is what it is.
That's awful.
Yeah, it does suck, but what are you going to do? Thanks everyone for tuning in. Sorry we were not here last week. I am not going to be doing my live stream tomorrow because they're coming to fix my Wi-Fi again. Although somehow I got through this live stream.
Mostly, there was one.
There was some wobbly, but you have no idea. I've been trying to do consultations all week, and it just keeps going out and out and out. I've had to reschedule a bunch of appointments because of this, so it's been really quite the nightmare. But it is what it is. I'm an astrologer. I know Mercury's retrograde. I don't I just sort of power through it. And I have Aura Gel. Thank you, be heavens. I've got more of it in my mouth than is available on the market right now. Yeah, I've Aura Gel, Tylenol, all that stuff. It only does so much good. So I'm kind of in trouble. I'm going to have to see a dentist real soon.
Oof. I'm so sorry to hear that.
Yeah. Anyway, I didn't even want to bring it up, but there you are. It just happens to be what I'm going through, and I'm feeling kind of crappy as well. But thank you, Watson. Who are you, Watson? Tell us who you are.
I'm Patrick Watson. I'm an astrologer, and you can find me and my work and my services at patrickwatsоnastrology.com. You can also find me on most social media websites at pwatsonastro.
All right. And I am Nick Dagan Best. You can find me at nickdaganbestastrologer.com. And I'm generally in better shape than I am today. But always, even in the shape I'm in today, I love giving consultations. I love talking astrology. And so, yeah, I'm available for all kinds of astrological services if you're so inclined. Right. Without further ado, thank you, Patrick. And we'll see you next week. We'll be here. We're going to keep this regular, and let's see. Oh yeah, David says, I'm a Bernie supporter, so I like this discussion, but you probably lost a lot of your right-leaning followers. Yeah, maybe. I don't. We're not really trying to. I mean, I'm not a Trump guy, but I'm saying Trump's going to win. So yeah, I don't think anyone should be bothered by our political opinions if you have different ones, because it's not really like we'll talk about people we don't like, and at least do their astrology fairly.
Right. I mean,
like people who love Trump might not like the way we talk about him, but we're doing his astrology sincerely. And that's really, at the end of the day, the important thing, the thing we have to, you can go anywhere to hear people badmouth Donald Trump, but only here are you going to, I think we're astrologically speaking, we're, and it's not, we're not doing it to be fair to him, but in order to do this work properly, you simply have to do the work fairly, no matter who you're talking about. Right.
Yeah. I mean, I think that it would be way more insincere for us to like hide our distaste. I mean, I'm not gonna sit here, like, I've had so many people accuse me in the past of like being a biased astrologer, often by astrologers who predicted Romney would win in 2012 and who thought Trump would win in 2020. So bias sort of cuts both ways, but I think it's way more insincere to pretend like I don't have, like, I'm a human being and I have a perspective, and I don't really care, like, if you think I am not being fair. Now, I do think though that despite me being a human being and having my own opinion and having a feeling on these important matters, being someone who has a stake in how things turn out, being an American citizen, and a human being, I think I'm not for everyone, but I think that even someone who is a steadfast Trump fan could and should still appreciate the kind of analysis we bring, because it is still good astrology, even if we personally aren't like for your guy or whatever.
I make it my business.
Not that I am trying to get the approval of Trump fans. I'm not exactly crying if right-wing people don't want to watch me.
But we're not here specifically to troll them. We're not here specifically to troll them. That just we at the end of the day, it's astrology is an exercise in empathy, but empathy is not sympathy. You can empathize with Trump without being sympathetic to him. And by empathizing, meaning how he's feeling. You have an insight into how he's feeling and how he reacts to things. And the guy's actually quite in that regard, he tends to be straightforward. Like, his motives are pretty transparent, much as he tries for them not to be. He kind of can't help but be. But the whole thing is, if we're looking at his chart, we are looking at life through his perspective, and it's kind of irrelevant, the fact that we don't share his perspective, but we do want to use astrology to be able to sort of get a sense of who he is and how he sees the world and how he sees himself. And that's the honest attempt that you're going to make reading
Right.
anyone's chart. And it's
Right.
yeah, and on that level, it really is kind of irrelevant whether or not you actually like the person. That's
Right.
not
Well,
the job at hand.
yeah.
Your job is
Right.
not to like or
Right.
dislike someone. Your job is to correctly analyze their horoscope and,
You know,
and
I've
understand their
had,
astrology.
yeah, I mean, I've had people who have sold me for services who, you know, have kind of made it clear in
Yeah, sure.
more explicit or less explicit ways that, you know, they feel a particular way on certain topics that I disagree with vehemently. But I, you know, yeah, I see my job at that point. It's more important that I'm an astrologer in that
Yeah.
moment than
Yeah,
that I am, you know, a progressive leftist. You know,
yeah. We're guns for hire. We're guns for hire, and so some.
having said that, though, I do reserve the right to
Sure.
refuse service, you know, on certain basis. Obviously, not for like protected categories, but you know,
Yeah.
I'm not a gun for hire for the Trump campaign. Let's put it that way.
No, not in that regard. But I just mean like if you have individuals like you're talking
Yeah,
about, certainly, yeah. I've
sure.
read for individuals who I have very
Right,
very different values from, but you know,
right.
I'm their gun for hire for that hour, and I'll still help them, you know, in their day-to-day life use astrology.
Sure.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for turning up. Sorry we weren't here next week. We will be here next week. Sorry we weren't here last week. We will be here next week. I won't be here tomorrow, but next Monday I am going to have Sam back on my solo live stream to wrap up our conversation, our ongoing conversation that we've been holding all summer. And of course, next Sunday, Watson and I will be back here to who knows what. That's the thing. We rarely have a plan, but
We'll see.
we'll come to something. All right.
Take care of yourself, Nick.
All right. Thank you, Patrick. Thank you, everyone, and we'll see you all next week. Ciao.
Bye.